The morning sky above the airport was a smooth, pale blue, brushed lightly with drifting clouds as if painted. Carefully to calm nerves and soothe minds, it was the kind of sky that made pilots feel at ease, made passengers think of soft landings and easy journeys, and made Captain Harris trust that the day would pass without incident as he completed his final checks in the cockpit, sipping from a paper cup that held lukewarm coffee and years of routine, the kind of coffee that tasted like reliability and repetition. He glanced at the flight manifest, scanned through familiar names and cabin layouts, and nodded to himself. Everything seemed normal, as it always did. Cabin crew moved with rehearsed precision, smiling and gesturing as the last of the passengers boarded with dragging bags and sleepy expressions. Row 9 remained unoccupied for longer than expected, but the delay was minor and Harris paid it no attention until the boarding door almost closed and she arrived without fanfare, without apology, her stride quiet and focused, her eyes scanning the seats as though she was looking for something or someone, until she stopped at row 9 and sat down. Seat 9. See, the aisle seat, the only one in the row not yet taken. She placed a worn leather bag under the seat in front of her and sat upright, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees, but her eyes never still. They wandered over the cabin, the overhead compartments, the wings visible through the small round windows, and finally toward the cockpit, as if she could see through the door and into the panels, into the systems, into the very pulse of the plane itself. And for a moment she seemed to hold her breath, as though listening for something no one else could. Here then she blinked and settled into silence. Captain Harris gave the all clear, and the plane began to taxi down the runway, engines humming with smooth promise. Crackle of the intercom as the first officer made light remarks about weather conditions and arrival times overhead. Bins vibrated softly under mild pressure, and the smell of reheated breakfast trays began to drift from the galley. But back in row 9, the woman did not move. She did not speak. She did not reach for her phone or a book or a napkin. Her attention was somewhere else, maybe in the sky, maybe in the machine, maybe deep within her own memories that no one else could access. As the plane lifted from the runway and climbed into the morning air, the flight seemed just like any other for the first 20 minutes. The sky remained calm and the ride steady and uneventful. Captain Harris took another sip of coffee and watched the panels. Out of habit rather than concern, the systems blinked back at him in practiced rhythms, everything where it should be, everything within tolerance, but something about that stillness felt slightly too still, like a breath being held for too long. And just as that feeling began to form into a thought, the first soft jolt rippled through the frame of the aircraft, followed by another harder one, as though the air became something thicker and more uncertain. In row 9, the woman opened her eyes wider, but did not react like the others around her, who looked around nervously or tightened seatbelts or whispered anxiously. She simply adjusted the position of her hands on her knees and tilted her head ever so slightly, as if the sound of the turbulence was speaking directly to her, telling her a secret that only she had the knowledge to understand. And when the lights flickered above and a voice from the cockpit asked the cabin crew to secure all loose items, her expression did not change. She was already preparing for what would come next. The second jolt was stronger than the first, and this time the lights did more than flicker. They blinked off completely for 3 full seconds, long enough for every person on the plane to feel the sudden shift from calm to uncertain, long enough for quiet murmurs to become rising voices, and for some passengers to begin looking around with wide eyes, as if expecting someone to explain what had just happened. Captain Harris sat forward in his seat, brows drawn and jaw set, as warning lights began to appear across his control panel. A low alarm sounded, a sound he had not heard in a very long time, not since his early training days when simulations pushed every system to the edge of failure. The cabin oxygen masks had not yet dropped, but the atmosphere had shifted from mild concern to the quiet stirrings of fear. Flight attendants moved quickly and with practiced calm, telling passengers to remain seated and secure their seatbelts, their voices slightly too firm, slightly too loud for comfort. And still, the woman in row 9 did not flinch, did not speak, did not look around like the others. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on the front of the cabin. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to calculate something in her mind, as if listening to frequencies no one else could hear. The turbulence came again, a deep vertical drop that lifted drinks from trays and startled cries from lips. Passengers gasped, some cursed, others prayed. One child near the back began to sob as his mother clutched him tightly. Captain Harris gripped the yoke and spoke into the radio, requesting immediate status from ground control, but only static, replied the systems. Showed partial failure a short in the electrical bus that had begun to affect auxiliary power and flight controls. They were flying half-blind, and the backup protocols had not kicked in as they should have. That was when she stood without waiting for permission, without asking for assistance. The woman in row 9 unbuckled. Her seatbelt took her leather bag from under the seat and walked calmly and deliberately down the aisle toward the cockpit. The flight attendants moved to stop her, one of them placing a hand out, but something in her expression made them pause. Her voice was quiet when she spoke, but carried a weight that pushed past panic. She said she needed to speak to the pilot. She said she knew what was going wrong and that she might be able to help Pat first. Captain Harris refused to allow her entry. He had dealt with anxious passengers before, people who claimed to know more than they did, but something about her voice, something about the way she named specific systems by memory, systems he had not mentioned, made him hesitate. He looked through the small cockpit window at her face and saw not fear but deep familiarity, the kind that comes from long experience, from someone who has spent thousands of hours thinking about machines that fly. He gave the nod, and the crew let her in. She stepped into the narrow space and set her bag gently on the floor, then without hesitation pointed to one of the panels and explained that the electrical issue was not random, that the sequence of faults matched a known failure mode seen in certain aging aircraft parts that were rarely replaced on time. She asked for a tool, something simple, even a pen would do. And when the co-pilot handed her one, she opened the side access panel and began to trace the wires with the care of someone who had once designed them. Captain Harris watched her work, and slowly the alarms began to fade, one by one, systems returning to green. Not perfect, not safe, but better than before. The woman glanced back at him and said she needed 10 more minutes, and then maybe, just maybe, the plane would fly steady again. 10 minutes felt longer than any stretch of sky Captain Harris had ever flown through. The cockpit filled with the hum of low power and the distant sounds of passengers in varying states of confusion, fear, and hope. The woman knelt beneath the control panel, her hands moving with swift, quiet precision, as if her fingers remembered something her mind had locked away years ago. The wires she worked with were aged, brittle, some barely insulated, some likely missed in regular maintenance, and she handled them like old bones, careful and deliberate. She asked the co-pilot for a flashlight. Not a small plastic one, but the heavy one kept in the emergency kit under the seat. She needed its beam to check a narrow circuit tucked behind the panel near a set of relays that had likely overheated. She explained that if the fault continued unchecked, it would trigger a cascade that might not disable the engines, but would lock the navigation into a frozen loop, making it impossible to land properly on manual or autopilot. Captain Harris listened, and something in her voice, the confidence, the detail, the absence of panic, made him feel, for the first time since the first jolt, that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Outside, the cockpit clouds gathered heavy and gray, stretching into wide bands of unstable air. The turbulence returned in small, sharp shudders, and the plane rocked side to side, but held altitude for the moment. The passengers could feel it too, the difference between falling and fighting, between helplessness and a kind of invisible resistance, and still none of them knew what was happening behind the locked door of the cockpit. None of them knew that the quiet woman from row 9 was tracing the life veins of the aircraft by memory. Aloud she spoke again, this time to no one in particular, more like she was talking to the plane itself, murmuring softly as she adjusted a fuse and reconnected a power node with a copper wire stripped from her own bag. She had come prepared not for this flight, but for something like this, her tools basic, her knowledge precise, and her timing uncanny. She seemed to know exactly which component would respond and which would not, which section to bypass and which to breathe life back into, as if she were part of the system herself. Captain Harris asked her name, and she paused for a moment, then gave it quietly. Maya Lin. Then she returned to work, not offering more, not explaining who she was or where she had learned these things. Just Maya Lin, as if that was enough, and in that moment, it was because the lights above them blinked once, then steadied the static in the radio, cleared just enough to allow a garbled transmission from ground control and the warning alarms that had screamed and wailed began to fade into silence. They were still in danger, still far from landing, still flying blind in some systems, but for the first time, since the fault began, the plane felt like it was listening again, like it wanted to stay in the air. Like it wanted to help them return, the mystery woman stood slowly, her eyes scanning the dashboard one more time, her hand brushing against the yoke, not to take it, but as if offering quiet thanks. Then she turned and walked back into the cabin, returning to row 9, without a word, without asking for anything. She sat down once more and placed her bag gently beneath the seat, her face calm. Her eyes closed and her breathing even as the intercom crackled and Captain Harris announced that they were stabilizing, that everything was under control, and that they would begin descent shortly, but no one around her knew she was the reason they were still flying. No one knew that the quiet woman in row 9 had just saved every soul aboard. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from tense to cautious relief, but the echo of the recent crisis still lingered in the air like a heavy fog. Passengers whispered softly, exchanging guesses and prayers. Some stared at their seats, some reached out for loved ones' hands, but the woman in row 9 remained motionless, her eyes closed, but her mind alert, as if she was still holding on to the fragile thread that kept the plane's steady flight. Attendants moved quietly down the aisles, offering water and reassurance, their faces pale but determined, their smiles tight and practiced. But behind the front of calm, the crew felt the weight of the unknown. They knew something had almost gone terribly wrong, but no one knew exactly what or who had stopped it, except for Captain Harris and the woman who sat silently in row 9 seat. Che caught her eye as he walked past on his way to speak with the senior flight attendant. He gave her a nod, a small gesture of gratitude, but she did not respond. She just looked back with an expression that mixed exhaustion and resolve, and something else, almost like a secret she was holding close and would not share the conversation in the cockpit. It was brief but intense. Captain Harris and his co-pilot reviewed the systems one last time, while Maya Lin leaned over quietly, suggesting a series of checks and manual overrides. She spoke softly but firmly, describing what to monitor and how to compensate for potential secondary failures. Outside the plane, the storm clouds thickened, casting long shadows across the landscape below the ground. Crew prepared emergency vehicles and cleared runways, anticipating the plane's arrival. But the pilot and his mysterious companion were focused only on one goal: to keep the plane aloft and bring every passenger home safely. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, a young mother in seat 108 rocked her child gently, whispering soothing words, trying to mask her own trembling hands across the aisle. A businessman stared blankly at the window, tracing raindrops as they slid down the glass, while a teenager scrolled endlessly through a phone screen, desperate for distraction. And yet none of them noticed the subtle changes in row 9. The way the woman shifted slightly, as if gathering strength, her fingers tightening around the leather bag, her jaw setting as if preparing for something that had not yet come but was coming fast. Suddenly, the intercom crackled, and Captain Harris spoke again, his voice steady and calm, announcing that the plane was beginning its descent, but warned of continued turbulence and urged everyone to remain seated with seatbelts fastened. The passengers listened closely, some relief flooding their voices, while others braced themselves for what lay ahead. But the woman in row 9 remained still, watching the crew and the passengers with eyes that missed nothing. As the plane began its slow descent, the angle of the wings shifted. The engines hummed with renewed power, and the cabin lights dimmed, slightly signaling a transition toward landing preparations. But beneath this, controlled surface tension remained thick, a silent reminder of how close they had come to disaster. The woman in row 9 pulled her bag closer, and from inside she produced a small folded piece of paper worn at the edges. She looked at it briefly, then tucked it back inside her bag, her fingers tracing the folds as if drawing comfort from the familiar creases. But when a curious flight attendant asked if she needed anything, she simply smiled faintly and shook her head, declining any further assistance. Captain Harris kept glancing toward the cabin door as if expecting her to come back or say more, but she remained seated, quiet, mysterious, and resolute, a puzzle he was beginning to realize he might never fully understand, but one that had become his lifeline in the sky, a guardian disguised as a passenger who had come from nowhere and saved everyone without recognition or thanks. The plane continued its Descent slicing through thick gray clouds, the runway lights appeared far below, faint and flickering like stars, struggling against the storm, and as the wheels touched down with a jolt, and the passengers erupted in a mix of cheers and tears, the woman in row 9 closed her eyes once more, her face calm, her mission complete, and the mystery still alive. The plane slowed gradually, rolling along the wet tarmac. The sound of tires against asphalt mingling with the distant shouts of emergency responders and the low hum of rescue vehicles, their flashing lights reflecting off the fuselage like urgent beacons in the fading storm. The passengers remained, seated eyes wide, open hearts. Still pounding from the ordeal, many whispered prayers of thanks. Some clung to the arms of their seats or held hands tightly across the rows, while others just stared. Ahead, still processing what had just happened, Captain Harris released the seatbelt latch and stood up, moving carefully through the cabin to address the passengers. His voice calm, steady, and full of gratitude, he praised the crew for their professionalism and the passengers for their patience, but his eyes searched the crowd for the woman from RO9, the one who had somehow entered the cockpit and altered the fate of the flight. But when he reached her seat, he found it empty, as if she had vanished. Into thin array flight attendants standing nearby caught his attention, handing him a small leather bag. The one she had carried on board, the captain opened it carefully. Inside was a single metal pen and a folded note with a message written in careful script. The note read, "Some flights choose their own co-pilots and nothing more." The captain felt a chill run down his spine as he looked around the cabin, trying to find anyone who had seen where the mysterious woman had gone, but no one had noticed. Her live news crews began arriving at the airport, eager to cover the miraculous landing. The story quickly spread about the sudden technical failure, the skill of the pilot, and the calm professionalism of the flight attendants, but no one could explain the presence of the woman from row 9, or the role she played behind the scenes, and when reporters asked passengers, no one could offer much beyond vague descriptions of a quiet woman who had seemed strangely detached from the chaos, yet deeply connected to the survival of the flight team. The following days, Captain Harris found himself haunted by the encounter. The woman's knowledge, her calm under pressure, and the cryptic note she had left behind fueled countless conversations with colleagues and experts in aerospace engineering, but no one could identify anyone matching her description or background. The records showed no recent hires or consultants with such expertise, and no missing persons reports fit the profile of the woman who saved the flight. The metal pen became a symbol for the captain, a reminder of how fragile human life could be, and how sometimes strangers could arrive in moments of crisis. With the power to change everything, the captain placed the pen carefully on his desk, a silent tribute to the mystery and the miracle aboard the flight. And he found himself often staring at it, wondering who she was, where she had come from, and why she had chosen this particular plane, this particular moment. Meanwhile, the airline launched an internal investigation into the technical failure, reviewing maintenance, logs, and flight data to prevent any similar incidents. But even as they worked to improve systems and protocols, the story of the woman from row 9 took on a life of its own among the staff and frequent flyers, a legend whispered in terminals and lounges, a tale of a guardian angel in disguise, whose presence on the flight was more than coincidence. Families of passengers reached out to the airline, seeking information and expressing gratitude, but Captain Harris remained the only person who knew the full truth and the only one who carried the secret in his heart about the quiet hero, who had no name, no past, and no explanation, only the simple note and the unshakable feeling that some flights choose their own co-pilots, and sometimes those co-pilots come from nowhere. Days turned into weeks since the miraculous landing, and the story of the woman in row 9 lingered in Captain Harris's mind. Like a persistent shadow that refused to fade, he found himself revisiting the flight data, the maintenance logs, and every detail he could recall, from the moment turbulence first hit to when calm was restored, but every technical explanation seemed incomplete. Every answer raised more questions, especially about Maya Lin, the name she had given when pressed briefly in the cockpit. The captain made discreet inquiries among airline staff, airport security, and even local authorities, but all came up empty. No records of Maya Lin boarding flights, no employment history, no identification found in any database or passenger lists beyond the manifest on that fateful day, and even the leather bag left behind vanished without a trace when the airline luggage department searched the lost and found. Captain Harris's colleagues began to notice his distraction, his late nights reviewing systems, his lingering gaze at the metal pen resting on his desk. They spoke quietly about the toll the incident had taken, but Harris welcomed the focus, the obsession with uncovering the truth behind the woman who had saved their lives. The pen became more than a symbol. It was a mystery piece, a puzzle fragment he hoped to solve. Meanwhile, the airline's technical team made progress. Understanding the electrical failure, discovering a hidden manufacturing defect in a batch of wiring installed during a previous overhaul, the revelation validated the woman's assessment in the cockpit, and the quick action taken to bypass the fault likely prevented a catastrophic crash. The company promised to recall and inspect all affected parts worldwide, but still no clues surfaced about the identity or background of Maya Linda. Media caught wind of the story, and reporters began to speculate wildly, from secret government agents to corporate spies, or even a vigilante engineer who appeared when disaster struck and vanished again. But no interviews or sightings of the woman emerged, and the passengers who had glimpsed her described only a calm, composed figure who seemed disconnected from the chaos and fully in control of the crisis. Captain Harris sometimes dreamed of the flight the way it played out, with perfect clarity. The sudden jolts, the failing instruments, the woman stepping forward, the hands moving with skill and certainty, the power slowly returning, and finally the smooth descent and landing. But he also dreamed of asking her questions about who she really was, why she helped, and what she expected in return. But the dreams always ended before he could speak, and he woke to the dull ache of unanswered mysteries. The pen remained on his desk like a talisman, a reminder that sometimes salvation comes from unexpected places, and that not all heroes wear uniforms or seek recognition. Captain Harris wrote a personal report recounting the events and the woman's vital role, emphasizing the need to recognize those who help beyond their job descriptions. But he left out the parts that no one would believe. Though life returned to its usual rhythm, the captain felt a subtle change in himself, an awareness of the fragile thread that holds life and machines together, and a deep respect for the unknown forces that intervene. When all seems lost, he often wondered if the woman would ever return, or if her help was meant only for that one impossible flight. Months passed since the flight that had nearly ended in disaster, yet the presence of the woman from R09 lingered like an unspoken secret among the crew and passengers who had shared the experience. Captain Harris found himself increasingly drawn to the memory of Maya Lin, her calm demeanor, her precise knowledge, and the way she had moved through the cockpit as if she belonged there, as if she had been waiting for that moment all her life at the airline. The story became something of a legend, told quietly in crew lounges and briefing rooms, a reminder of the thin line between catastrophe and survival, a story that inspired respect for the unknown and for the unexpected saviors who sometimes appear when hope seems lost. Harris was invited to speak at conferences about the incident, the near failure, and the vital intervention, but he always mentioned the mystery woman, only in passing, never revealing her full role or the note she had left behind. Despite the public attention, Harris remained private, his focus inward, wrestling with questions about fate, coincidence, and the strange intersections between lives and machines. He spent hours at the simulator replaying the flight over and over, searching for clues, hoping for insight. And still, the image of Maya Lin sitting quietly in row 9 remained vivid, her eyes full of secrets and sorrow. One evening, after a long day, Harris received an unexpected message, an email with no sender, simply an address to meet at a small cafe near the airport, a note attached saying, "If you want answers, come alone." And listen, he hesitated, but curiosity overcame caution, and he found himself sitting at a corner table watching the doorminutes passed before a woman entered the cafe, her features partly hidden beneath a hood. But there was no mistaking the calm, purposeful stride, the way she scanned the room until her gaze settled on him. She smiled faintly and removed the hood, revealing the face he had never forgotten, Maya Lin. Her eyes, steady and searching, they spoke quietly, sharing fragments of stories, fears and hopes. She revealed little about her past, only that she had once been part of a top secret aerospace program shut down due to political pressures, and that her skills had been honed in situations where failure was not an option. She said she traveled the world quietly, helping where needed, often unrecognized, but always ready to act when fate demanded. Harris listened intently, feeling a mixture of relief and renewed mystery, her presence answered some questions, but raised others, especially about why she had chosen this flight, why she had trusted him, and what she expected now in return. Maya Lin only smiled and said, "Some flights choose their own co-pilots, and sometimes those co-pilots find their way back to where they are needed most." Before leaving, she handed Harris a small device, no bigger than a credit card, a memory drive, containing data she had collected during the flight and some personal logs that explained her work in vague terms. She said it was a gift, a tool to help the captain understand that survival was not just about machines, but about trust, connection, and sometimes a little pathos. She walked away, disappearing into the night. Harris felt a weight lift and settle all at once, a sense that the mystery was not meant to be solved completely, that some answers were meant to be lived with, carried quietly in the heart, like a secret prayer for safe travels and silent guardians. The days after their meeting drifted by in a strange calm for Captain Harris. The memory drive lay on his desk unopened for hours before curiosity finally won and he plugged it into his computer. The files revealed data logs, video footage from cockpit cameras, and encrypted notes that hinted at a deeper network of helpers like Maya Lin. People who moved quietly behind the scenes, fixing failures and preventing disasters unseen by the public or even the authorities. Harris spent nights poring over the files, the technical details confirming the severity of the failure and the precision of the fixes, but also revealing coded messages and coordinates that suggested a global system of aviation. Guardians, people with skills, knowledge, and courage who chose to intervene when the stakes were highest. It was a world he had never imagined existing just beyond the veil of everyday life. He wondered if Maya Lin was part of something larger than himself, than the airline, than the flight itself, something that transcended the ordinary rules of jobs and duty, something closer to a calling, a mission to keep the skies safe at any cost. The memory of her calm voice and steady hands grew clearer each day, a symbol of hope and unseen protection. In a dangerous world, the captain shared parts of the discovery with trusted colleagues, those who understood the gravity but also the need for discretion, and they agreed to keep the secret safe, respecting the mystery. And the women who chose to remain ghosts in the system, still ready to appear when fate demanded. Harris himself found a new purpose in the knowledge that survival depended not just on machines, but on the courage and sacrifice of strangers who answered a call few could hear. He began training new pilots, emphasizing vigilance, trust and intuition, and the possibility of unseen allies, a lesson learned from the mysterious woman in row 9. In the quiet moments before flights, he would sometimes glance at the metal pen resting on his desk, a reminder that some miracles come in the smallest of packages, and some heroes never seek fame or thanks, but act because they know that every flight is a fragile journey between earth and sky, between life and the unknown. The woman from row 9 never returned to his flights or to the airline, but her presence remained a silent guardian in his mind, a symbol of hope in the face of uncertainty, and a reminder that sometimes the most important co-pilots come from nowhere and vanish without a trace, leaving behind only gratitude and the enduring mystery of the skies.